Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's live broadcast of Clinical, Regulatory, and Commercialization Strategies for Rare Diseases. I'm Lisa Henderson, Editor-in-Chief of Applied Clinical Trials Magazine, and I'll be your host today. This webinar is presented by Applied Clinical Trials and sponsored by MAPI. MAPI is a leading global organization offering evaluation and support of therapeutic strategies. With offices worldwide, MAPI provides high-quality and efficient operations to help their clients secure product approvals and reimbursement, as well as addressing post-marketing requirements and late-phase needs, meeting the needs of patients, physicians, regulatory authorities, and healthcare technology purchasers. We do have some important announcements before we begin. This webcast is designed to be interactive, therefore your participation is helpful. You can interact with the speakers during the Q&A session by simply typing your questions in the Submit Question box located below the viewing window. You can submit your question anytime. We'll be doing the Q&A at the end after the two presentations. You can enlarge the slide window at any time by clicking on the Enlarge Slides button located below the presentation window. The slides will advance automatically throughout the event. If you are experiencing technical problems with viewing or hearing this product, please click on the Help button below the viewing window. Leading off today's discussion is Ron Christensen, MD. Ron is the Chief Medical Officer of MAPI and was the former Director of Endocrinology at Phoenix Children's Hospital. As Senior Director of Medical Affairs at Genentech, Dr. Christensen was responsible for the management and direction of 4 groups: medical information, drug safety, epidemiology, and post-marketing studies. With over 25 years of industry experience, he was a member of the NIH Office of Rare Disease Research Committee that developed common data elements, selected initial participants for the NIH Global Rare Disease Registry. And our second speaker is Dr. William C. Mayer, Chief Scientific Officer and Vice President, Epidemiology and Risk Management at MAPI. Dr. Mayer has over 20 years of experience in drug development and commercialization at pharmaceutical companies in Europe and the United States. He was previously Senior Director of Epidemiology at GlaxoSmithKline and Elan Pharmaceuticals and led research groups conducting observational research using registries, databases, chart reviews, and field research to support reimbursement, marketing, and drug safety investigations of pharmaceuticals throughout the world. He was head of respiratory epidemiology at GSK and was instrumental in the conduct and publication of several studies describing the epidemiology of COPD and the impact of therapy on COPD mortality and exacerbations. He has worked on over 100 observational studies in several disease areas, including respiratory, neurology, psychiatry, autoimmune, cancer, endocrinology, cardiovascular, cerebrovascular, urology, opioid dependency, and vaccines. So now we will turn it over to Ron.
Hi, everyone. Good morning, and thanks for attending. Let me just walk through what Will and I'll be presenting today, and we'll probably start off with some basic information about rare and orphan diseases and the importance of orphan drug development in pharmaceutical industry today. Then we'll talk about patient registries for rare and orphan diseases, and then some of the other strategies for pre, peri, and post-approval registries and other kinds of clinical studies that are done in the rare and orphan disease space. And then Will also has some case examples to present. So we'll start off with kind of the definition of rare and orphan diseases, and some of this may be basic for others, for some, maybe not so for others. There's some important new information that just recently came out about the importance of drug development for rare and orphan diseases as well. As I mentioned, we'll talk about the various types of clinical studies and registries that are conducted in this space in all phases of development, pre, peri, and post-approval, and helping to transition from the clinical development stage into commercialization. And then how can data from studies be used to provide access to patients with rare diseases, since oftentimes there's an unmet patient need? So just a few definitions, and some of you may be familiar with this, but in the U.S., the definition of a rare disease is a condition that affects less than 200,000 individuals. And in the EU, it's 5 in 10,000 individuals, which is approximately 245,000 individuals in the EU. There's more than 55 million people in the U.S. and Europe that are affected by a rare disease. And globally, it's something like 5,000 to 7,000 rare diseases, and new rare diseases are described each week, about 250 new rare diseases every year. And of course, as you know, there are many of these diseases that there is no treatment available. This is some recent information. This comes from a law firm that works in this space, and from a recent analysis of the numbers of orphan drugs that are out there. Just for review, the Orphan Drug Act was signed into law about 30 years ago in 1983. Last year, there were 25 orphan drugs approved. In 2011, there were 26. And in the U.S., there's a total of 420 orphan drugs that have been approved between 1983 and last year, 2012. There are 2,700 approximately orphan drug designations in the U.S. approved in those 30 years. In 2011, it was 203, and then a little bit less last year in 2012. And I'll show you a graph demonstrating on the next slide how this has increased over time. FDA has granted designation to approximately 70% of all the requested designations submitted in those last 30 years. In the EU, orphan drug designations increased 44% in 2012, and there are a total of 898 orphan designations in the EU, with 65 approved orphan drugs. Here's the graph I was mentioning again from the law firm referenced below, and you can see that that over time the numbers of all designations and as well as those achieving approval have increased. The tallest bar, the blue bar, is the number of designation applications submitted, and then the red bar are the ones that received marketing approval. So you can see the increase over time. And again, another reason why the orphan drug space is hot in terms of drug development. And these are some other reasons. And this comes from some recent information. I present this because it's so brand new. This comes from Evaluate Pharma, that just released this orphan drug report in April of this year. Orphan drug sales worldwide are expected to grow to $127 billion between 2012 and 2018. So that's a 7.4% annual increase, and that's double what the growth rate of overall prescription drug market is, excluding generics. In 2018, according to this evaluation, orphan drugs will amount to 16% of all non-generic worldwide drug prescription sales, and that's up from 5.1% in 1998 and 12.9% in 2012. So it's 1/6 of all prescription drug sales by 2018. Novartis is still the lead orphan drug maker with sales of $11.8 billion, and Roche's Rituxan is the biggest selling orphan drug with sales of $6.9 billion. I'll give you a caveat about that in I believe it's the next slide. So here's really some of the reasons why pharma has embraced the whole orphan drug space. We all know that many of the large pharma companies have expanded their development pipelines to focus on orphan diseases, and I'll give you some reasons why in just a second. There are also many smaller, particularly biotech companies with orphan products that are in the crosshairs of pharma as a target to acquire because of their rare disease pipelines. So biopharmaceutical companies have demonstrated that orphan drug development is a really viable business model. And a lot of that relates to the fact that there are reduced R&D costs. The phase 3 trials are smaller just because it's a smaller number of patients that are available to evaluate. There are tax credits in the U.S. where there's a 50% tax credit on research and development, so they recoup 50% of their costs in the U.S. There are also some R&D grants in the U.S. FDA has some, NIH has some, and there are other entities that provide some grants as well. So there's a greater return on investment for orphan drugs than non-orphan drugs. It's about for orphan drugs, there's about a 10.3 times return on investment versus 6 times for the investment on non-orphans, or a 1.7 times greater return on investment. And again, that's largely related to the fact that phase 3 trial costs are less. There's also market exclusivity, so 7 years in the U.S. and 10 years in the EU. And of course, many of these orphan drugs can turn out to be blockbusters, Rituxan, Revlimid, Soliris, and there's others. For the purposes of this particular analysis done by Evaluate Pharma, they did not include some of these huge drugs like Avastin, Enbrel, Herceptin, Humira, and Remicade, because only about less than 25% of their worldwide sales or lifetime sales have been related to the orphan indications. And of course, orphan drug development and genomics may help companies meet the needs of personalized medicine as well. And orphan drug research brings public relations benefits to pharmaceutical companies through the patients, the advocacy groups, the practitioners who are addressing these unmet patient needs. So as far as drug development issues related to orphan drugs, it is in some respects a tougher space to do drug development, because of the small patient populations and, of course, the severity of the diseases that they have. And there may be no alternative treatment, so there's a certain amount of urgency to find treatment modalities for these diseases. It's also difficult to run sufficiently powered clinical trials, so they're often open label studies versus a randomized controlled trial. There's often no control arm. It may be necessary to use a surrogate endpoint, and there's oftentimes limited information on drug efficacy and safety at the time of regulatory filing. There's also a safety-first clinical and regulatory mindset, especially since a lot of these are pediatric populations, and whenever it's a pediatric population, there's an importance to have safety first kind of mentality. We'll be talking more about the unmet patient need and the fact that you may need to do something pre-approval to provide a product prior to approval. And then there's usually a need for some observational data both pre- and post-approval. Oftentimes in this space, there'll be a pre-approval, if we want to call it a disease registry of that population to get a sense of really what's happening, the lay of the land, the landscape of what's happening in that patient population prior to doing any drug development. And then there's often, which will go into expanded access programs or compassionate use studies. And oftentimes there are mandated post-marketing effectiveness and safety studies by the regulatory agencies. So there are various types of clinical studies that are done for orphan diseases. As far as clinical trials that may be used for registrational purposes, this may be done through the biopharmaceutical companies and their product development. There's a lot of academic and governmental research. I'll give you an example of the NIH Global Rare Disease Registry in a moment. And a lot of investigator-initiated studies, physicians who have an interest in evaluating patients with rare diseases. And of course there can be disease registries that are more natural history type of programs, product registries evaluating the use of a specific product once it's approved, and oftentimes a pregnancy registry is done in conjunction with that. We'll be talking more about the types of studies that are done in the various phases of development for a product. It can be done pre-approval, peri-approval, after the pivotal studies have been done, such as an expanded access program or a safety extension study, and then post-approval. Again, that may take the form of a post-marketing requirement, as in the U.S., or a post-authorization safety study in the EU. And again, expanded access or compassionate use. This is just a schematic of some of the non-interventional types of studies that can be done. It can be either prospective or retrospective in nature, so it's just a prelude to some of the other types of designs that we'll be talking about. So let's talk about patient registries for rare diseases, and I think that's probably one of the more common types of things that are done in the rare disease space. You've probably seen these definitions, but I think it's always important to make sure that we're all coming from the same place. This is the one that comes from FDA on good pharmacovigilance practice and pharmacoepidemiologic assessment. And I highlighted a few words here because I'll also show you the AHRQ definition, and they're similar in some respects. An organized system for a particular disease or condition, and evaluating exposure to some substance. And here's the AHRQ definition. Again, you see there are some similarities: organized system, disease, condition, exposure. This one's slightly different. In the last part of it, says that it serves one or more predetermined scientific, clinical, or policy purposes. Registries can be sponsored by many different entities. Oftentimes it's the biopharmaceutical industry who are doing drug development. But also academic and governmental entities such as the NIH, investigator-initiated kinds of registries. For many of the rare diseases, there are groups of investigators that have their own registries for rare diseases. Of course, the advocacy groups are very active in this role, and I'll give you a couple of examples here about that. They're setting up their own more patient-driven types of registries. And then the professional societies as well are involved in developing registries. As I mentioned, some of the advocacy groups are doing more patient-reported types of registries. And here data are provided by the patient or possibly the parent or other care provider And it's basic information like identifier and demographics, history, diagnosis, treatment information, possibly some genetic or genomic information, or in some cases even a biorepository. There may be some patient-reported outcomes, not maybe some, but it's not as much as one might do in a more of a sponsor type of study. Generally, there's no clinical data. And some data, such as genetic testing, can be curated oftentimes by a genetic counselor. But these data are really valuable for patient advocacy groups to build a relationship with the patients who have that disorder. And it's valuable for identifying patients for clinical trials for pharmaceutical companies and understanding background data to guide clinical trial development and really looking at the natural history of that particular disease with various treatments that may be available or even no treatments at all. And some examples of that are the Global Rare Disease Registry, which I'll mention next, which is developed by the NIH. Connect, which is a number of patient registries run by Patient Crossroads. Kyle Brown was involved in the NIH GRDR, and he runs that program, and he has quite a large number of registries that are more of these patient-reported types of registries and typically sponsored by advocacy groups. And the Genetic Alliance has a new registry development program called Reg for All. The Global Rare Disease Registry, which I was involved with the NIH, the mission was to, some of the things we're talking about here, a resource for research, recruitment tool for clinical studies, what the diagnosis and management is of patients, a biorepository, and for information and education. And this all started in 2009. There was a workshop in 2010. Then there was a selection committee in 2011, I believe, and we chose 12 organizations with an established registry and 12 without a patient registry. And it's now being piloted. This is just that sort of a reference of some of the things that have been published out of GRDR. So some of the benefits of registries, they're very multifaceted, but the importance is getting real world therapeutic data on effectiveness, safety, and even some of the humanistic types of data you get from patient-reported outcomes. They're, of course, very generalizable to the population at large, although these are typically small patient groups. It is reflective of the real world. And as I mentioned, they're very multifaceted. You can do product registries or disease registries or pregnancy registries, and sometimes these can all be combined together, where you have a combination product, disease, and an arm where there's a pregnancy registry if a woman gets pregnant. And they can either be a cross-sectional snapshot or a longitudinal type of program, which is probably more typical. And then you can also do sub-studies where you may want to look at one specific aspect. Maybe you want to focus one sub-study on patient-reported outcomes or maybe health economics or some other aspect that you do as in just a subgroup. And of course, there's a lot of heterogeneity. There may be some private practices. There may be some community hospitals. There could be academic centers involved. So there is that heterogeneity. And of course, because this is real world, study subjects are heterogeneous as well with the various types of treatments, although in this space, oftentimes treatment options are limited, concomitant meds and comorbidities. But these kinds of programs are great for evidence-based medicine, for outcomes and reimbursement, which we all know is increasingly important in today's world with the payers, and very beneficial for that. Mechanism for comparative effectiveness research, although again in the rare disease space there aren't a lot of available treatments, and there's not a lot to compare other than maybe a treatment versus no treatment. They're also great for interactive communication and data reporting back to the investigators, so that the investigators have a sense of really what treatments are doing to impact their patients, as opposed to waiting for the results of the phase 3 clinical trial to get the results. And as I mentioned, also valuable for identifying patients for clinical trials and for a repository for genetic or genomic or biospecimens. And so some of these applications of patient registries, the effectiveness and safety of real-world treatments, looking at treatment patterns, what types of patients are being treated and how is this product being utilized, and then continuous quality improvement and developing standards of care so that over time you understand the best way to use a certain product to treat a certain condition. Looking at some of the important humanistic aspects of treatment, so patient-reported outcomes and quality of life, but other things like compliance and tolerability and satisfaction with treatment. And then health economics may weigh in here, particularly as it comes to reimbursement, cost effectiveness and burden of illness, and healthcare resource utilization. And the other thing that can happen is some of these patient-reported registries, you can combine data from those patient-reported registries and merge that with clinician data to have some clinical corroboration of the patient-reported data and really have a more complete picture of how that patient is doing. Patient-reported data is very valuable, and the clinician-reported data is very valuable, but each one just done separately sometimes isn't as powerful as merging the two together. So I think, Will, I'm going to turn it over to you, and he's going to talk about pre- and peri-approval studies.
Okay, thank you, Ron. I'm going to, as Ron mentioned, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the studies that can be done or might even be required to be done, both in the pre-approval setting for an orphan drug in a rare disease, and also in the peri- and post-approval setting. Are you advancing the slides for me, Ron, or should I do it myself?
Sure.
So let's talk a little bit about pre-approval registries for rare diseases. So, sometimes in some of these rare diseases, not a lot is really known about the disease itself, and as a result, it's useful to do some type of epidemiologic study of the disease. Now, this could be looking at the occurrence of a disease to help you understand how frequently it occurs. You may remember that Ron said that there are some requirements in terms of occurrence. It's often hard to do a study of a rare disease, but doing a study of treatment patterns or existing patients can really help to understand the occurrence of the disease and a little bit more about how a new drug might be beneficial in it. It also can be the precursor to assembling a disease registry, which could be useful from the point of view of helping to understand how patients are treated, and also as something that you can use to build upon later on as you get to the point where you might want to run a registry to follow a product. These studies may also help us to understand diagnostic, treatment, and clinical outcomes, so we can look and see what's happening to patients currently, how they get recognized, what treatments they receive, what kind of outcomes they are incurring over a long period of time. Statistics, so what's the burden of illness? How do patients perceive it if they can record it? What are some of the other impacts that they might be able to describe? Can we understand what the economic burden of this disease is? Also looking at physician practice patterns. So how do physicians in different countries tend this disease. Oftentimes with a rare disease or a disease where there's an orphan indication for one potential therapy, there's a lot of different treatment options that are used anyway. And so it can be very useful to understand that, because in the context of a different country, the treatment patterns and care paradigms look quite different. You can also look at patient management issues. There could be, for the reasons I just described, different treatments, or it could be a fairly complicated way in which patients will need to be treated. And if so, if your particular intervention is particularly complicated in the way that it needs to be administered, this can have a profound impact on the patients, and you're going to want to have an understanding of what some of that potential impact could be. It may also help you to understand endpoints for your clinical trials, or how big your clinical trials will need to be in order to do clinical development. And then it can also be useful just in hypothesis generation, and that might be in any one of these areas. So when we look at the types of studies for rare diseases that we can do, in the peri-approval, so just right after we have approved the drug, or just around the time of approval, one of the ones that Ron mentioned earlier was something called an expanded access program, or a compassionate use program. And this is something that we see more and more occurring in the rare disease area, where we might not have quite enough patients to do a full phase 3 clinical trial program of the type that we normally expect to see with a pharmaceutical. So there may be some time that is required to assemble the requisite number of people, and there could be some opportunity for the drug to be provided prior to approval. Again, if it's more of an orphan kind of situation, there may be no real alternative therapy. So once the drug has gone through some phase 1 testing, it's possible in many countries that it could be made available under an expanded access or a compassionate use program. And I can give you an example of that one. There could be a safety extension study, so there could be some kind of open label study or a follow-up study done kind of under clinical GCP. There can also be a phase 3B study, which can be something that's like a kind of an slight expansion of the phase 3 trial. Usually these will be product specific, and they would be initiated upon completion of a phase 3 trial, or if it's a particularly rare disease, a kind of phase 2, phase 3 style trial. It can get quite, it can be quite a lot of hybrid designs here, because there's a desire, if people recognize that the treatment modality has a fairly strong likelihood of efficacy, then working in a realm where you have like a phase 2 design with a bit of phase 3 elements, but maybe not at the same sample size that you would have expected for a different kind of drug, is something that in many countries they will look at and evaluate as a potential option. Sometimes peri-approval studies are a bridging strategy between a pivotal trial and product launch. So, you might have completed your trial, your drug's in review, and so you will be running an expanded access or compassionate use program in that period of time prior to a drug approval. And then, of course, it could be an investigational new drug. And, it's becoming a bit more common in certain areas, given, a lot of issues around healthcare payers and a variety of other things, for there to be, more flexible or good situations with respect to these studies. One of the examples I wanted to talk about is one that we did, which was an IGF-1 deficiency registry. And what we were trying to do here was identify a target population for a new drug. So this was an interventional epidemiological study, which means that although it was an observational study, there was an interventional component. And what we were trying to do was look at the prevalence of the deficiency of a growth factor in a population of short-statured children, because this particular drug was targeted toward people with that particular genetic deficiency. And then collect clinical data, baseline, and a blood sample for hormonal and genetic analysis. So again, you can see why this would be an interventional study, because we are collecting blood, and in many cases this will be considered an intervention. Now, that doesn't mean that it's the same kind of intervention that it would be if we were exposing people to a new therapy. And so you can see that there's even in epidemiology, there's a great, and in this area, there's a gradation of differences for the term interventional. We were targeting to get 300 patients. We had a 12-month recruitment period with 90 sites in 9 different European countries. And what we collected was clinical data, and then we also did some refund of patient travel expenses if they had to come back into there. And this was all collected and then done through centralized laboratory testing and centralized genetic analysis. And it was a successful study that helped to kind of better understand the occurrence of this particular genetic abnormality or deficiency in these different countries for the purpose of the sponsor. So I think we went far. Sorry about that. Okay, so now I wanted to talk a little bit about expanded access programs. And I mentioned that they may be called compassionate use programs or named patient programs. These are programs that allow access to the drug prior to its approval. And the laws in different countries like the United States or Canada or in Europe are different, and they have different criteria under which you can make this available. In some cases, this can only be done in the context of a study. Sometimes it can be done on a named patient basis where individual patients can be nominated and then they would be approved either as part of a schedule of availability in terms of their indication. And then in some cases you can be paid for it under a reimbursement program by the national payer, in other cases no. So, what's going to be happening? Well, it's going to be implemented generally after the evaluation of the phase 3 data and prior to product approval. But there has to be a fair amount of safety data, already available. On this particular product. And in many cases, you're going to be collecting some type of surveillance information about the drug itself. So you might have to learn, you'll definitely have to follow up for adverse events and adverse drug reactions. And there may be some type of other clinical data that you would be required to collect in these patients. Next slide. So, and then cohort access, which means that we've got an identified subgroup of individuals who can be treated and supervised according to a set of criteria and in a protocol of therapeutic use. It's like a cohort system or expanded access program. The nominative access, which means that you don't have to make people part of a study, but rather they are nominated on a case-by-case basis. This is something that also can occur, and it can occur in some places. It will occur in the same country, so you can have an either-or situation. Well, what are the benefits to the patients? I think that's just one of the big criteria that has to be considered here in the context of a particular idea, and that is that it can provide access to patients with serious or life-threatening diseases who have no real alternatives, and in case they might be willing to accept the greater amount of unknown risk, really, that could be taking this therapy at this point in time of its development cycle. It can allow patients to maintain some autonomy over their own health care decisions. I mean, people generally look to, receive benefit, and they're looking to this variety of options that they can get a hold of. In the U.S., we have something called the treatment IND that can help, bridge the gap between the later stages of product development and approval by making the drug widely available during that time. In Europe, it's a little bit different situation, and it varies by country. However, what we are seeing is that in some cases, you have situations where people in Europe have run an expanded access program, and then they've collected data, and then that data has been useful, if not, it's been highly instrumental in terms of gaining approval for the drug for an orphan indication and a rare disease in the United States. It doesn't usually work the other way around because the European situation is a lot more stringent relative to the U.S. situation. The other thing that's kind of important to remember is that usually you can't do an expanded access program in lieu of clinical development. I mean, of course, that could be ideal from a sponsor's point of view in some circumstances, but that's not going to be relevant. So what are some of the sponsor benefits? Well, again, pre-launch product visibility in some cases. You'll get additional real-life data. You can look at some of the interactions with other existing therapies, whatever they might be, even if they're largely palliative. Get a better understanding of the side effects. Thinking about, what the physician, the pharmacy, and the patient and advocacy engagements and acceptance of the products are going to be once it gets up there. So you're learning about how the patient population and the doctors themselves are going to be using the drug, which can be very beneficial from the point of view of even a regulatory agency in terms of ensuring that the best instructions go out at the time of a product launch. There can be improved safety warnings and recommendations for use. It can help to support reimbursement and health technology assessment. And this is an area that has changed a lot probably over the last 15 years or so. And that is that traditionally, rare diseases or orphan diseases were not considered to be particularly have a huge impact on the budget of most healthcare payers, and they were covered, without really a lot of extra review of cost effectiveness or health burden or something like that. But that's changing. One of the reasons it's changing is just because of the price of some of these medications is very high, and also there's been a pretty high volume of drug development in the rare disease area, so that's sort of increasing the overall budget that's being devoted to these rare diseases. You're not allowed really to promote EAPs, so you can't go out and detail around that. And so what this means is that it's kind of hard to let people know that it exists. You'd have to let them know through some sort of indirect means. You might be able to talk about it in the context of a professional society with a specialist, but that would probably be just about it. So so I wanted to talk about one that we're doing at the Region Duchenne's muscular dystrophy. Now, the phase 2 results showed that this particular drug slowed disease progression, and so they decided to set up an expanded access program in the based on people who'd already been in the phase 2 study. And there was a sample size of about 120 and a follow-up of about 5 years. And the data that was collected was safety and also monitoring for utilization. Here's what I wanted to provide you. It's just a little bit of an understanding of the type of data that would be collected in something like this. And, this is an example for this particular study. I think what you can see here is that, by and large, this is kind of clinical parameters, also looking at a lot of information about safety, probably not as much in the way of patient burden or efficacy as you might expect to see in a clinical study. At the same time, there was a lot of focus on baseline data collection, making sure that it was well understood, the type of patient that was getting this particular drug, and what else was happening to them. But there was a relatively minimal follow-up over time. So, as I kind of was alluding to, that in general there's a minimization of other types of data, such as efficacy. This could be required by ethics boards, and it might depend on the kind of product. So if you're dealing with a gene therapeutic product or something like that, this could be required as something like that, and it, of course, might depend on the country too. Patient-reported outcomes such as symptoms or quality of life or satisfaction are generally not collected. They could be, but generally they probably would minimize. Resource utilization and cost. Again, we mentioned that was a possibility. This is something that could potentially occur. The volume of patients that you're going to generally go through something like this, well, they might not be that large in most countries. France might be a bit of an exception, but it'll also, of course, depend on the occurrence of the disease and a clinical decision about the value of this particular therapy. And as we said, it can be, it could be more extensive to help support some understanding of some of these other areas. So I try to give you some idea of kind of peri-approval or, things happening just around the time of approval. In many cases, when you have a drug like this, you're going to be making a post-approval study commitment. And the post-approval study like this will probably be some kind of registry. So it could be your disease study, your disease-based registry that you started pre-approval, or maybe the IND or some other type of study that you were conducting and you are rolling patients over from that into real-world use. And you start to follow people, and then as more people come online, you add them. It could be a product registry, or it could be a combined disease and product registry. I mean, I guess what I'm trying to highlight to you is that there tends to be a lot of heterogeneity about the origin of these particular registries and in terms of how they get used in the post-approval setting. So you can set up your own study, de novo, working with groups of doctors, or you might tap into some other existing registry that's ongoing. In many cases, they'll have the same data elements as in a pre-approval IND study, and they'll probably collect clinical information, safety information, economic, and humanistic outcomes in a real-world clinical setting. What are some of the differences, though, between a post-approval registry for a rare disease and maybe some other kind of study that you would run in a rare disease? Well, one of them is that you're using a commercial drug, so you're not paying for the drug. You're getting paid for the drug. It will be naturalistic, so it's the people who are using it might be people outside of the indication. It's generally advocated that you collect the drug use for everyone. In most countries these days, that's exactly how they want if they're going to ask you to do a post-approval clinical of this type. It won't be an IND study. It will still be IRB approval. We might do it under something called good epidemiologic practices, good pharmacoepidemiologic practices. It will probably also have a broad and diverse physician participation. Now, it kind of depends. I mean, this one is a little bit more challenging in some cases than it looks like. You might assume, if it's a rare disease, only specialists will treat it, but it could be one of those situations where the specialists initiate the therapy, but have to do follow-up at the general practice level and some other kind of secondary care setting. So sometimes that can take a bit of working to get all the data that you really need. Here's another one that we did. It's the phenylketonuria Expanded Access Program and Registry. And I have really talked about this one because it combines the elements of all that I've been talking about, which is to say that we were working with a company that had a product for the treatment of phenylketonuria that they set up an expanded access program with. And so they were trying to use it to understand the looking at how this could be used as an orphan drug. And then at the same time, they were advocating for fast-track status in the United States. So the expanded access program for these patients began at the NDA filing, and the expanded access program registry addressed several unmet needs of these patients. One, it collected clinical, humanistic, and safety data. There were 42 sites that were ultimately included and about 400 patients, and these people were treated and followed until product approval. The post-approval registry really built on that particular design and expanded it a little bit. So it was a post-marketing requirements to be initiated post-approval. There was a commitment for 4,000 patients with 100 sites with 15-year duration, and this was ultimately expanded to Europe after the approval of the drug over there too. There was also a sub-registry looking at maternal exposure. So you may remember Ron said that you could potentially connect pregnancy exposure. And so this is not uncommon in this case and was done in this case. And it was looking at kind of routine data collection, but on a quarterly basis starting out and then eventually switching to annual basis. Baseline looking at demographics, history, neurological and neurocognitive evaluations, behavioral and developmental assessments, dietary phenylalanine intake and history, blood phenylalanine level and history, medication dosing, lab tests, concomitant medications, and genotyping. And basically, it was a fairly comprehensive post-approval registry with the goal of really understanding, everything about the drug once it gets into the world setting. So this is pretty much the end of our slide. But at this point in time, we just want to summarize and say that this is a new area it's not new, but it's been increasing substantially. There are a lot of data requirements, and the use of observational studies to help support this is a really important part of this, both the drug development and the commercialization process, maybe even more so than in traditional larger population pharmaceutical products. And at this point in time, we would be happy to take the questions.
Okay, thank you, Will, and thank you, Ron, for both of your informative presentations. As Will mentioned, we are going to begin the question and answer portion of the presentation. Before we take some of the questions from the audience, I just wanted to note that due to time constraints, we may not get to all the questions that were submitted. So let's get to the first question, and I'm not sure who would like to address this, Ron or Will, but if either one of you would like to jump in. When is a disease registry for an orphan disease or product implemented versus a product registry?
Well, I'll take a shot at it. Oftentimes in the pre-approval period of a product, maybe a company is working on a product for development for a rare disease, often will, as I think both Will and I were saying, oftentimes it's interesting to do a disease registry of that particular disorder earlier on to understand maybe some of the study endpoints and maybe some of the challenges of treatment and those types of things. In other words, kind of get the landscape of that particular disorder sort of in parallel while you're doing clinical development. Of course, to get a product approved, it would have to be more of a clinical study, and as I said, there are some challenges to doing those. But then in the post-approval space, typically it could be a combination of a disease and a product registry where maybe you take all comers with a particular disorder. Certain of those patients are treated with a new product that's recently approved and others are not. Or it could be just a product registry by itself. So there are various combinations that one can use in terms of disease and product registries in this space. Will, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, I with that, I think it will just kind of depend ultimately on how you view the value of looking at, disease registry information. I mean, in many cases, it could be pretty much the same type of follow-up process. So it might not be that much different to do a disease registry versus a product registry. It's kind of at the later stages of product development. Whereas early on, it won't be possible to do a product registry. We really only will do a disease registry.
Okay, great. And then this next question, they're asking about monitoring. Their thinking is that monitoring on-site or the on-site visits are not usually required during the conduct of registries. Is this true, and how are registries monitored for quality?
I can add. I can start with that. Yeah, I mean, so basically, what we have is a situation where we do minimal monitoring. They're usually done, by cause monitoring, and then the maintenance of the sites is done via telephone. There may be a monitoring visit to confirm that the patients are actually in the study at the baseline, and then there could be a random monitoring around. But what you won't see is the type of monitoring that you would expect to see in a phase 3 clinical trial done under GCP. And the reason the type of data that we're looking for is a much broader scope of information around, and we use that in the context of product surveillance. So, of course, we want things to be accurate, but there's a fairly high level of accuracy that can be ensured by the kind of validation process that I'm describing there.
Yeah, this is typically the risk-based monitoring type of approach where there are certain triggers that if you identify certain triggers, then that may prompt more rigorous monitoring, even on-site monitoring.
Great. Another question, and again, I'm not sure who would like to field this one, but how or when can patient registries be set up or coordinated and then used for orphan drug products intended to treat a medically plausible subset?
Will, any thoughts on that? I'm not sure I quite understand.
Yeah,
the medically plausible subset. I'm just not sure.
Okay. You know what? We can get back to that question after the presentation. You can get back to them. So one more question. How are patient registries used to address post-approval studies for orphan drugs mandated by regulatory authorities?
Well, of course, we know that increasingly in both Europe and U.S., we're seeing more and more post-approval requirement studies pass in the EU and in the U.S. Post-marketing requirement studies mandated by FDA. And again, because these are rare diseases and oftentimes in the pediatric population, not always. I mean, PKU is an example where there are adults as well, but these are pediatric populations, and usually there's more scrutiny that is expected for that. There are mandated post-approval types of programs like a post-marketing requirement study, and primarily one's focusing on safety, but also there's some effectiveness data that would be important to get, and I think increasingly we're seeing more and more patient-reported data as well to, as I mentioned previously, it's nice to merge that patient-reported subjective information with the clinical information as well. So registries are increasingly being used as a way to fulfill post-marketing commitments worldwide. Oftentimes, if a product starts in the U.S. and then goes to Europe or vice versa, both EMA and FDA will have similar type of post-marketing mandated studies.
Excellent. Well, unfortunately, we are out of time. I want to thank the audience for their interesting questions. I want to thank the speakers for their exciting presentations, and I want to let the audience know that the team will respond directly to your questions that weren't answered after the webcast. This webcast will be available for on-demand viewing through May 2014. You will receive an email from Applied Clinical Trials alerting you when this webcast will be available for replay. Please invite your colleagues who may have missed this live event by forwarding them the announcement, and we will see you next time. Thanks.